Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Pooja. Thank you so much for having me. Sorry, my cat is also making an appearance.
That's okay. You shared a whole lot with me, Sarah, when we first met, maybe a couple months ago now. And I think the audience would appreciate hearing some of it for context. Can you share a bit about your background?
Sure. So I am a healer, and I incorporate astrology, tarot with spiritual life coaching in order to help people who are navigating major life transitions to find confidence, peace, clarity, and to really transform through transitions.
Awesome. And you told me a little bit about what led you to becoming a healer, and a big part of that is your caregiver journey. So could you give us a brief overview of who you were caring for, what was that major push that got you into this?
Yeah, it's been honestly a kind of multi-layered journey. My father, I lived in China for 7 years, and right before I moved to China, my father, he had debilitating arthritis. So I was, slowly over a period of years seeing him deteriorate. But I was actually with him when he passed, and I gave him energy healing, as he transitioned, which I feel like was the sort of the opening of this portal of both grief and also the healing process. So I navigated that, and then my brother passed away actually while I was in China, and I was not able to go back home for the funeral because it was very intense at that time with the pandemic, and if you left the country you pretty much couldn't get back in. And so then my mother, and then the most recent chapter has been coming back to the US, which was not originally in my plans, but I did in large part because my mother, who's now 88, was navigating health challenges as well as emotional challenges and loneliness, from being alone, and also obviously the emotional strife that is connected to losing a child. And so essentially I came back to Philadelphia to really support her as she moves through this final phase of her life. And it's been quite a journey, but I've been living with her for the past 2 years and, helping her while also growing my business, which I started around the time that I left China.
Yeah. Can I ask what led you to live in China for 7 years?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It was not on my bucket list, even honestly, of places to visit. But I was living in New York City, and the last chapter of my life, I taught French and Spanish in high school, middle and high school, and I was just ready for a change. And my last year in New York was when I really opened up my intuition. When I started meditating, I learned energy healing, started doing all the energy modalities that I do now. And I just went to an international job school fair thinking, let's see what's out there. I speak fluent French and Spanish. And so I thought, well, maybe Europe, someplace, or maybe Latin America. And it just so happened that all of the options that I got were places like Mumbai, Dubai, Latvia, Cairo and Shanghai. There was so much synchronicity in terms of the offering that I got, but and this is what happens. I feel like when we open ourselves up to, our intuition and connecting with our intuition is the universe brings you what you need, not necessarily what you want. And so it just gave me this incredible offering, everything that at that time I really was best suited for me on a platter, moving to a place that had a very thriving expat community, which I loved, living abroad, getting to experience Asia, worked at a phenomenal school, and which was also a bucket list item. So that's kind of the short version, but it was me. It was not anticipated for me to kind of, wrap up my life in a couple of months and then move across the world to a place where I knew nobody. But sometimes it's just how life rolls.
Yeah, and I'm sure, looking back on it now, it hopefully was one of the best experiences of your life, right?
Absolutely. And also, it was a very healing experience. It was interesting having to go through the healing process of having just the grieving process of just losing my father was actually, it was a new chapter that I was starting in my life. And in some ways, to be honest, it was easier because everything was new, and because I wasn't in, I wasn't in the house where he had passed. I would say the most challenging part was when I first came back, the first time I came back to visit the US, and then being back in the house and being back, just in that energy. But it was, yeah, it was phenomenal. And also just being in Asia and traveling and seeing so many incredible places, and also experiencing spirituality through that lens of travel, going to a place, connecting with the energy of the land, going, for example, to Thailand, sitting in the temples, and just really, it helped me to really understand myself on a deeper level. So I was very fortunate to travel to many incredible places while I lived in Asia. So it was a really beautiful chapter. The pandemic, maybe a little bit less so, in China, because there were a lot of restrictions and lockdowns. But it's all part of your journey. So
yeah. My husband and I just recently this year we went to. We originally went to India to visit family, and then we went to Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia. And I agree with you. And just, it's so eye-opening just seeing different worlds, like different cultures, and how they help each other, especially in Asian cultures, right? Just seeing what things could look like from, a caregiving perspective, a healing perspective, a grieving perspective. You're not truly on your own, which I often feel like many people in the States are, right? And so I agree with you. I think just seeing that was a really good experience. Now, so you mentioned that you were in China when your brother then passed. How did you navigate that unexpected passing while you were living abroad?
Yeah, it's so interesting to have had two different experiences with grief, because with my father, I saw him, I think it's a different experience, having a loved one and slowly seeing them start to deteriorate, because you're able on some level to prepare yourself, versus my brother, who was 45 at the time. And I didn't even know he was in the hospital for a week prior. It was a shock. Honestly, it was a complete shock. And fortunately, I had a really strong support system of friends. And that's what I did. I relied on my friends when I was there just to help me through it. And I virtually was able to join the funeral. So at least I felt, but to be honest, that was really more for, I feel like for my mother, because for me, I have such a strong spiritual practice that the other part of this that really helped me in terms of moving through the grief was connecting to my brother, connecting to his spirit, creating an altar, so creating a space where I'm, honoring his memory, where I feel like I can talk to him, where I can connect with him, and just feeling that he was at peace. That feeling when I would connect to him and knowing that was what helped me the most. And I also feel like when we go through a loss of a loved one, that is something that can be really the most comforting for any person, ultimately, to know that, especially if they went through suffering, if they went through difficulty. My brother had autism. He didn't have an easy life, and he had some health conditions as well. But just to know and to feel really that he was good, that he's at peace, so they didn't need to worry about him, that was an incredibly healing part. But I had to go through, honestly, the second chapter of the grief of my brother when I came back to the US, just being in the house again and going through, obviously his toys from when he was a child, books, the energy is there. And so it kind of opens up Pandora's box again. And then it's the next layer of grief that it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. That's one thing I've really learn through this experience with grief. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not a just, okay, it's going to be here for a month, it's going to be here for a year, and then we're done. No, you go through, you do the healing process, and then something can happen that just can trigger an opening. And so it just means that there's more emotions that are coming out that it's time to hold space for. But the other piece of this that I would also say that's really helped me, both with him and also with this process, honestly, of slowly watching my mother decline, has just been holding space for my emotions, really holding space for and allowing them to, when they come up, when I need to cry, I allow myself to cry. When I get angry, because anger is also a part of grief, allowing myself, in a healthy way, maybe to punch a pillow or to get that out. That's been one of the most important lessons that I've learned through this journey.
Yeah, that's really hard. I really resonate with how you described, the grieving process in general. It's not linear. It comes in waves. You might think you're fine, and then you see something or hear something, and it triggers you right, and you're right back into it. So you mentioned earlier too, after all that, you returned back to the States, and that was where you had to kind of revisit that layer, right? Or peel back another layer. And that was not just for your brother, but for your father too, right? Because you kind of left as soon as he passed. And so you kind of had to come back to this home now where both, the memories and the energy of both your father and your brother were in there, but you were back to help your mom. Mm-hmm. What were the initial challenges that you faced when you decided to return and care for your mom?
The challenges were really less in regards to my father and my brother and the healing that needed to happen with that, because my father also passed 7 years ago. So I did come back. I would come back twice a year while I was living in China. So I had time to kind of move through and process, but more in regards to the relationship with my mother, because we had 2 years where... Are you able to see me? It says you can't. Sorry. Okay, because it looked like the screen froze. Sorry. So there were 2 years in which I wasn't able to come home at all. My relationship became, rather estranged with my mother. And I know that was challenging for her, not having, her daughter, which I'm the only family member left really with my mother. She's got a brother, she's got cousins, but nobody lives here, so I'm it. And so it was honestly going through the relationship and repairing, in a sense, the relationship with my mother, because there was a lot. I feel like when you also live away, this was the first time that I had lived away. When we're talking away, I'm not talking, okay, you live in California and your parents live in New York. It's a different thing when you live in China. You can't just get on a plane if something happens. And so being that far away, I had really come into and owned who I was and realized who I was independently versus the identity that I had constructed my entire life in regards to what I thought would make my mother happy, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And my father happy as well, but primarily my mother. And I feel like we all women, we have a relationship with our mothers, which can be really beautiful, but also complex. And so the biggest challenge for me, honestly, was being in that space with her again, living. It's not an easy thing when you've lived on your own to then be living with a parent, and also to be in this caregiver role where I now had to support her all the time. And she didn't really understand, boundaries. There weren't clear boundaries at the beginning. And it was also her, me doing this healing work as well, because being in my childhood home, all sorts of triggers came up, all sorts of things, that I didn't have the easiest childhood. And so going through and trying to heal that on a personal level while also supporting my mother when there were emotions I was moving through that I had to heal on my own, that were, resentment and anger, in regards to our relationship and the role, the tendencies, the things that you realize as an adult that are connected to your family environment when you grow up. And don't get me wrong, I love my mother and she did the best that she could, but this is just that's part of when trauma happens. It happens from age 0 to 7. And that's when you take on an unconscious level these behaviors that then create limiting beliefs and self-sabotage and everything that you then have to work through as an adult. So in short, it was going through that process of healing myself and forgiveness for my mother, while also supporting my mother and coming to peace with the relationship with my mother, when also for her it was difficult because on her end she didn't want to feel like a burden, and so she's always been very, very independent. So also trying to empathize with her while finding a way to meet my own needs. I think the biggest challenge in this has been And this is, I feel that this is something that caregivers a lot of times can struggle with, is making sure that my needs were met, because my tendency is always to make sure that everybody else is okay. And also, if you have a parent or if you have a loved one who is struggling or who is deteriorating or who has a health condition, you naturally, you want them to be, you want to help them, you want to support them, and it can go to the extent where you're just giving all of your energy and then you're drained. And so then I went through burnout, I went through physical burnout, emotional burnout. And so I learned kind of the hard way that I have to meet my own needs and I can't give from a cup that's empty.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest pieces of education and coaching that I provide family caregivers is you have to take care of yourself, because if something happens to you, then nobody's going to be caring for the person you're caring for, right? And so you have to take care of yourself first and then take care of the person that you're caring for. You've been home for 2 years now? How
Mm.
has your mother's health and integration with the community kind of changed over the past 2 years since you've been back?
She's become very isolated, very, very isolated, because as her condition gets worse, so she has scoliosis, she has arthritis, she is able to walk, but with a walker. But she's embarrassed. She doesn't want to go out in public. She doesn't want people to see her because she feels like she's bent over. She's always had a lot of pride. And so it's been very isolating for her. At the beginning, I would try to get her out. And I remember, for example, once we went to a Shabbat dinner. I grew up Jewish. I consider myself spiritual, but my mother is Jewish, and a very kind rabbi in the neighborhood invited us to come to a Shabbat dinner. And even at the dinner, most of the people were younger. And I feel like young people are not necessarily naturally going to gravitate to speaking to an 88-year-old. She had trouble hearing what people said, so I feel like that experience also m- m- contributed to her feeling isolated. And a big challenge that I've seen with my mother is mentally she's all there. Intellectually, she remembers things that I don't, but physically, it's the body that's slowly deteriorating. So it's been the isolation that's been the hardest piece. And also I see depression with her, and I
Mhm.
don't, and it's hard as a caregiver because you want to help them, but it's not, ultimately you can only do what you can do. And I don't always know in fact, I don't know most of the time when I see her and she's depressed, how to pull her out of it. If I'll say, would you like to go outside? I'll encourage her to do things, but even things like going into the backyard these days. We have a backyard, we have a garden where she can sit outside. She's not super motivated to do that. She is also isolated in the home because she decided that she did not want to go to assisted living. She was very much against that. And so we had to move her. She was on the second floor. She got to the point that she couldn't do the steps anymore. So we had to move her. She had a fall, came back after rehab, and we moved her into the first floor in the living room. And she's very unhappy with that as well, because for her, it's also these events that are showing her that she's not going to be able to go back to how her life was. And that's the thing that's the hardest for her, as someone who was super independent. Now she has an aide who's there 12 hours a day. And she said to me once, I feel like a piece of meat, when she's being bathed, for example. So these are hard, these are hard things to hear as as her daughter. She's not motivated to do it, even with the home health aide that she has, on her own. So the main challenge, I would say, has been depression and isolation. Those are the two things that I've been seeing consistently with her.
Yeah, that makes it really difficult. Depression's really hard with older adults because a lot of times, one, they don't accept it, right? They don't want to accept help. And then two, it's hard to pull them out of it because we have to understand that they are also grieving, right? They're grieving the loss of their independence. They're grieving the life that they had, and trying to accept the fact that their life is now going to be different. And so it's hard. You already mentioned kind of taking care of ourselves before we take care of others, or while we're taking care of others. What strategies do you use to ensure that your mom has the best quality of life as she nears end of life, but at the same time, balancing how you provide day-to-day care while also preserving your own quality of life.
Yeah, the single biggest help for me that made a major difference was getting help, hiring help, which if you're in the financial position that you can do that, because I know that insurances a lot of times don't cover this, was massive, massive. So now that she has an aide, I feel like you also, at the beginning, I was so used to doing everything that I was hyper vigilant and overly managing, and I had to release that. But that making sure that you have help, I would say, would be the number one thing that really helped me. Another thing is just making sure that you create space in your routine for you, even if it's just 20 minutes. For example, for me in the morning, I like to meditate or do breath work, do, stream of consciousness journaling. And so I make sure that I carve out space in my day to do that before I do anything for my mother. Or because what I also noticed when I was really getting to the point of burnout was that I was always directly going whatever it was that my mother needed and that created resentment, because I felt like I had no time or space for myself to honor the things that I enjoyed and my own needs. I also feel like getting out of the environment where your loved one is important, just to shift your energy. So of course, if you're not living with them, it's a different experience. I'm living with my mother, and this is perhaps a little more unusual, but getting out and doing something, for example, but something mindful, like going in nature and taking a walk in nature, is something that's an example of something that really helped me in terms of just refocusing my energy, calming me down, grounding my energy, bringing me back into presence. And gratitude as well, because I've had to tell myself this multiple times when we're going through, especially when it's a challenging period that is prolonged. We can sometimes go into the, why is this happening? Why me? When's this going to end? And again, it's important to allow yourself to feel all the emotions. But I always ask myself, well, what is this teaching me? What am I meant to learn? What am I meant to learn from my mother? Because she is my teacher. I mean, the same way that I'm her teacher. The people that trigger you the most in your life, which are also usually your parents, are your greatest teachers.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. It's really important. I talk about gratitude a lot too. I think there's, especially in today's, small world, but larger world too, there's so much that turmoil and so much that we can talk about as far as like, this is bad, this is wrong, this is, not okay. But if you have to take a few minutes to really identify the things that are going well, the things you're grateful for, the things that are good, so that you don't lose yourself into that darkness, right? Because that's part of it, right? You lose yourself into that stress, the grief, the darkness that comes with everything related to caregiving, especially for a parent. And so it's really important to do that. Now, you also mentioned a little bit about like navigating triggers and family trauma and all of that. Can you share some of the emotional challenges that you've faced while also holding this space for your mother?
Yeah, I've experienced every emotion that you could potentially experience. So there's a lot of course, sadness and the pre-grieving, when they're still here, but sort of thinking ahead, to when they're not here, the grief. So it's navigating the sadness and the grief. Resentment, I felt that at time. I have to be honest, because I think that that's something that is a lot of caregivers experience as well. Resentment, anger, and those were and then guilt. That I was feeling resentful, and I would say those were the most intense emotions. I've also gone through, I wouldn't say numbness exactly, but because I'm very empathic and I feel all the feels. I've had, the sadness and the grief that can be just to the point where you just don't want to do anything, where you don't want to get out of bed, where you think, okay, what's the point? I mean, I've had days where you wake up, like I've waked up, and I feel like this is something that you experience when you experience grief. You wake up crying, or you go to bed crying. So it's all of those emotions, and then also peace. And when this is the flip side, I also think about ultimately what I would like from my mother is I want her to be happy, and I want her to be in peace, and I don't want her to suffer. And I don't really feel like, this is, she will be here for as long as she decides to be here. But I also feel like when the time comes and she does transition, there will be a relief, which I'm sure there is for a lot of times when you're a caregiver, because you don't want to see your loved one suffering, and you want them to be happy, you want them to have that. So there is that emotion that I also feel, and as well gratitude for the time that I have with my mother, because when I get really frustrated, then I think, and frustration, that's another one, but I also I think to myself, because I'm planning on moving to Europe next year, and I think when you're in Europe down the line, you're going to look back, and you're going to look back at the pictures, and you're going to be grateful for this time that you have with your mother. And like now it seems like it's this portal that just keeps going and going, but everything has an end in life, and you'll look back. And so I've reminded myself of that. Don't try to rush the process. Everything is happening for a reason. Everything is happening in divine timing. And this is all just it's just part of the journey. And on the other end of grief is love, when you've moved through, and on just like in the darkness, on the other end of darkness is always light. So reminding myself of those things also have helped me when I've gone through the really intense emotions.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought up guilt and resentment. Those are two feelings that are very strong and very common, and yet very poorly discussed or brought up when you speak with caregivers. People feel guilty about feeling guilty, right? People feel guilty about the resentment. They feel guilty that they feel so stressed out and feel like they can't do or don't want to do what they're doing, right? And it's really important to talk about that. And you also mentioned relief for the person as they get out of their suffering, if they were suffering, or pain, or whatever it may have been. But it's also relief for the caregivers. And that's part of that resentment and guilt and grief that caregivers go through. But it's relief for the caregivers in that they can go back to building a new life now, right? They can go back to doing things they were doing before caregiving, or maybe they decide to create a whole new life, right? If they can. And so it's also a relief of that caregiving responsibility that they no longer will have, which is a mix, right? There's grief there for sure. There may be guilt associated with that too, but it is a relief on both sides of that, right? How has navigated grief impacted your approach to how you're caring for your mom now, and then also for your own life?
I have had a lot of, I don't want to say, well, I won't say a lot, but I've had some with the grief. Part of grief is anger that comes in,
Yeah.
and sometimes the anger comes in because it's easier for us to feel the anger than to feel the profound depth of sadness and loss and emptiness that comes from grief. And so I've had these moments of anger and of explosion with my mother that I've then felt guilty about afterwards, but that have also really pushed me to consider my own triggers and to consider how I am reacting, reacting instead of responding to a situation, or maybe not taking a moment to pause before I respond and allowing myself to respond in the emotion. So I feel like I've also really had I've learned a lot about grief and the experience of grief, and that it's so multi-layered. There's so many, and you can have this duality, like what you were saying, the thinking about, okay, it's the relief that will come when you get to have your life back, but then there's also the emptiness of not having your loved one there, and especially to lose a parent. I mean, to lose a parent is one of the most, I feel, challenging experiences that you'll have, that one can have in their life. And so in terms of navigating the grief, I feel like what's helped me is just understanding that it's not just one thing, it is many things. And so anger can be a part of grief, just like sadness, and also just giving myself some grace when it happens and saying, okay, all right, so that maybe that talk that you had an outburst with my mom, like not beating myself up afterwards. So I'd like going, talking to her, apologizing, which I usually do, but then not also sitting and stewing over it and feeling guilty and feeling like, okay, now I have to overgive because I did, because I lost it. So it's been quite a journey, but also I feel like it's really important with the whole processing of grief to allow yourself space to process it, because I know a lot of people who will push it away or push it to the side or try to focus on something else. And obviously we don't want to drown in it, but we also, if you don't allow yourself the space, from my experience, to move through it, it's just going to pop its head up in other forms down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's true for every emotion, right? If you don't express it, it bottles up and then eventually it explodes. Well, thank you for sharing your journey with the caregiving. I want to talk a little bit about now what you do as a healer. You talked to me about, or told me about, your certifications in astrology and life coaching. And so I want to talk a little bit about, how do those certifications in astrology and life coaching help you when you're coaching individuals and families through transitioning? And then how do you integrate astrology into your coaching practice, especially for those who are going through these challenging transitions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what astrology really helps you with it's twofold. It gives you a deeper awareness of who you are on the soul level, and then it helps you to understand what life phase you're going through, and so that you can feel like, okay, this is how I can work with the energy, instead of feeling like things are working against me. So it's like things are working for me instead of life. So life is happening for me instead of to me. That's one of the beauties of astrology. So when it comes to navigating grief and also family, you can look at a person's astrological chart, which is their energetic blueprint, and understand, okay, this is the energy of family in their life. These are the lessons that they're meant to learn through family. Even through, I've done synastry, which is where you look at more than one person's chart to see how they are meant to kind of teach each other, what are the lessons that they're meant to learn, like relationship astrology, for example. Same applies for a parent and a daughter or a son. So astrology can help you to better understand yourself, to understand your challenges, your strengths, what you were meant to, the karmic lessons that you were meant to experience in this lifetime, as well as your relationships. So when you're going through a process, perhaps of a challenge, maybe where you're in a caregiving role, or maybe you have an older parent, or maybe this is a sibling or somebody in your life, it can help you to understand, okay, this was the lesson that I was meant to learn through these experiences with this person. And it also helps you to understand on an unconscious level what you've taken on when you were a child that you're now working through and healing as an adult. All of that actually is in your astrological chart. So then I combine that with the coaching, because I'm a certified coach, to help as well as energy healing, to help people to, when they're going through a transition, to get to what's the root cause of what's happening. So if it's a pattern, let's say it's a pattern that's happening with relationships where somebody feels like they're never in a happy, healthy, loving relationship. Well, what's the limiting belief that's been causing the pattern? And then, okay, what healing can we do then to rewrite this story and to help the person to heal? I will also just add, inner child healing is one of the most powerful types of healing that you can do, that everybody really, I feel, should do, but especially when you're in a caregiver role, because part of what you're learning is, and through this process also of
letting go of your parent as they, transition. And when they transition is you need to learn to be your own parent. You need to learn to, to give yourself maybe the love and the kindness that you may or may not have experienced when you were a child, to know that you're going to be okay regardless of what happens with your parents. So I would definitely say inner child healing, which is one of the modalities that I do with people, is so incredibly beneficial for everything, really, but especially for your relationships, and in particular your relationships with family.
Yeah, that's really neat. I grew up in our culture, astrology is very highly respected, I guess is the word. And often, we don't do this, we don't practice this as much anymore in the States with the growing generations, but historically, like they'll do these astrological charts on newborns. They'll do them on for marriages, like compatibility matching and like all of that. And so it's really neat to hear that it also seems to guide the parent-child relationship as well. What lessons have you learned about navigating grief that you think are important for others to hear?
Give yourself grace. That would be the first thing. So, knowing that grief, first of all, grief is not, it's not, as I said earlier, necessarily something that where you're going to know the beginning date and the end date. Grief is something that can go on, it can go on for a year. It can seem like maybe, okay, I'm good, I've healed, and then something else comes in and triggers it. So just allowing yourself, when emotions come up, to really hold space for the emotions and to honor them, so that you can allow the emotions just to move through. Because that's one of the things that I've learned, is that when you really just hold space for the emotion, you allow yourself to feel it and then let it go, because emotions is just energy in motion. It is it's so much healthier, and it also helps you to really move through the grieving experience versus getting stuck and feeling in this place of, okay, I'm when is this going to end? When's the pain going to end? When's the sadness going to end? And also just understanding with the grieving process that this too shall pass. Everything in life is transitory. That is something that has helped me. And also the process of time and perspective. Honestly, coming back to the house, I thought when I came back to the house after my brother passed away, he passed away in January. I came back in July. That's when I moved back to the US. So maybe 6 months later. And I thought it was going to be really hard and painful, honestly, seeing his room, seeing all of his stuff. But there was such a peaceful energy in his room, that his room is actually what I've set up as my workspace, because I just love the energy there. I have 2 cats. The cats love being in the room, and I feel his presence. I feel him here with me. So I'd say another part that I really recommend with the grieving process is find a way to honor and connect with your loved ones, with the person who's passed over, because they're still here energetically, they're just in a different form. And so that's something that's really helped me, is having a ritual where I can just allow myself to connect with the person. You can do this in so many ways. It could be something where you make their favorite meal, after when the person is transitioned. It could, and then maybe you set a place, for them as though they're there, and just like inviting them in, inviting that energy in, because they are, as I said, they are still here. And I've experienced this. I've even, to be honest, this also really helped me. I saw a medium after my father passed away, after my brother passed away. I did a session with a medium. I got messages from my loved ones that helped me just to feel good, and like, okay, they're good. They're at peace. They've moved on. I can move on.
For those who might not know what that means, can you explain what you just said, like meeting with a medium?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, a medium is basically somebody who connects with spirit, who connects with the spirits of passed over loved ones, and is able to channel that energy to give you messages. So, for example, if you're let's say your mother passed away and you really want to connect with her, then if you speak to a medium will say, okay, your mother is, usually they will identify themselves some way to the medium to show that like this is the actual person. Like my mother loves jewelry. My grandmother, for example, came in at one point, and my grandmother loved jewelry too. And so she said, okay, this, she identified what my grandmother looked like, what she would show her. A lot of times passed over loved ones, spirits will kind of show objects that were important to them energetically when they were in this realm. And so then you can, they will communicate with you any messages that they have. Because one thing that I've learned also by being through doing these sessions with mediums is when they pass over, they're happy. They're in a good space, they're in a very peaceful space. And what's the most challenging for them actually is when you're unhappy and you're sad and you're at unrest. And so that tends to be when energetically they'll spend more time here. But so that's just a little bit about random side note about mediums if you're at all interested.
Yeah, thank you. What resources or tools, it seems like mediums are one resource, right? But what resources or tools have you found most helpful in managing and navigating the caregiving journey, but also the grief?
Honestly, learning about inner child healing has been super, super powerful and super helpful in terms of you navigating your own grief and trauma. So I would say that's one. There's a beautiful book called Life on the Other Side, which I highly recommend. Now, this is more spiritual, and this was also written by a medium, but it talks about when loved ones pass over. It talks about, kind of life beyond death. There's a hypnotherapist, Brian Weiss, who wrote a book. He wrote a few books. I'm forgetting the name of the book, but basically it's about, he did hypnotherapy with the patients and he regressed them to other lives. It's Many Lives, Many Masters. This was the book. And reading this book actually really helped to give me a lot of peace, because it was this understanding that we don't, when someone passes, they're still here. It's just they're not here in physical form. So I would say those are more spiritual resources, but that's honestly what has helped me the most in terms of processing grief, as well as understanding what the stages are of grief. That's something I know there are a lot of books, I'm sure, as well on that. And then seeking support. I really feel like that is so important, making sure that you have support in place, whether that's talking to a therapist or seeing a healer or a coach or someone, just to help you, because there's so many emotions, there's so much that comes up. It's an extremely big life transition, especially when you have a loved one who passes. So you want to make sure that you have, support to move through it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you've gone through this journey for quite a few years in different capacities. Can you share a memorable moment or a breakthrough that you've had while caregiving that has stayed with you?
Yeah, one actually was my mother, so I'm very spiritual, obviously, this is what I do. A spiritual healer. My mother is not. My mother is never really understood things like astrology, tarot, any of that stuff, not her thing, not interested. But one day I was sitting with her and I just shared, because she misses my brother, obviously. She talks a lot about my brother. It's not easy, as I said, to lose a child. And she said, and I said, Michael's still here and you can still talk to him. He's still here. He's just here in a different form. And I actually opened up and told her that I'd seen a medium. And I thought and I said, and he said, he's happy. He's good. He even said, I like it better here. And she actually was open to that. And it gave her, which I was not expecting, and it gave her peace. So I feel like having open conversations, like just having open, honest conversations is important. And also having an open conversation about what happens, like the transition and the end of life, is also important to do, because as a caregiver, it's uncomfortable. We don't necessarily like or want to have those conversations about things like funerals but you also want to be able to respect your loved one's wishes and to understand and really honor whatever it is that they want. And when the time comes, having gone through this in the past, the grief can be so immense that you don't want to think about things like having to prepare a funeral. So having those conversations early on, I feel it's a really important thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of my bread and butter, if you will. I'm constantly asking people or, trying to convince people to talk about these conversations early on. And yes, they're uncomfortable, they're difficult, they're not fun to have. But I almost, I say it's more uncomfortable not knowing what they would have wanted. And then you have to try and make decisions about it. Right. So absolutely. You mentioned that you plan on moving to Europe. I think when we last talked, you mentioned Portugal, and that's kind of your goal once this caregiving journey ends. How do you envision your life and career evolving when you get to that stage?
Complete new chapter.
Yeah.
Honestly, this being with my mother over the past 2 years, this has been a transition. I've been in this transition period for a very long time, and I've had to become comfortable with the not knowing and to make peace with and to learn to really be in the present moment, which has not been the easiest thing for me, especially as an air sign who tend to overthink. But the next chapter, and when I move to Portugal, really will be. I feel like it'll be similar to when I moved to China because it will be starting new, starting fresh, starting a new life. I also love Europe, and energetically, I feel better in Europe than I do in the US. And I think just by virtue of being in a place that feels good energetically, being able to have my own space, I have my two cats, but being able to actually, have our own space again, I feel like it's going to be just a really beautiful rebirth. And of course, there's going to be sadness that's imbued with that because part of this process also will be not having a home at the beginning, because I'm going to need to get the house together and then eventually most likely sell it. So it's also there, it's the joy and the sadness that are kind of mixed in because this was always my home. I would always come back to Philadelphia. And so it's going to be creating a new home, but also possibilities, so many possibilities because I won't have any limitations. I mean, by the same token, I won't have any close family that's left, which is a sad piece, but it's this knowing that I'll be creating my own family, moving forward, and I'll be totally independent and free to have my own life. So
Yeah.
that's what I envision.
Yeah. It's a true definition of bittersweet, right?
Yeah.
What advice would you give to other caregivers who are dealing with their own emotional challenges during these transitions or while caring for a loved one?
Definitely, as I mentioned before, don't push away the emotions, hold space for the emotions and find but healthy ways of expressing the emotions. So for example, anger, it's totally natural part of the grieving process, and resentment can be in there too as a caregiver. What I would do, for example, when I got really angry, I'd punch a pillow. I would punch a pillow and maybe yell into the pillow, and that's a really good way to get the energy flowing, to get it out. I mean, there's so many different things that you can do. Shaking is another thing where you put on music and you just shake. You shake your body for 2 minutes, and that's a good way to get the energy out and flowing. But just give your emotions space, hold, also don't push them down. Like if you do inner child work, talk to your inner child, ask him or her what do they need, and then honor it. So holding space for emotions, and when you need support, seek support. Speaking from somebody who did not, I was very isolated. I've been very isolated over the past 2 years. I don't really have community in Philadelphia. And part of this, I think, was me needing to go through some of these things on my own and experience this. But it's also easy to isolate yourself as a caregiver and when you're experiencing grief. So seek support. Maybe it's a support group. Maybe it's, connecting with others who are going through a similar experience, just connection. Human connection is so important. So, and I really think that can help when it comes to navigating the process and the emotions, and to know that you're not alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Having a good support system can really make or break the caregiving experience, and having trusted individuals within that support community is incredibly important. What is one takeaway you'd like the audience to consider as it relates to navigating grief, the broader topic of family caregiving, or even spiritual healing?
Make sure to hold space for your needs and honor your needs, and find, even if it's you can't energetically, as we discussed before, you can't give everything, and then you'll be depleted because your cup will be empty. So it's really, really, really important. And I've even speaking to other caregivers, I feel like this is one of the most common things that comes up, that you need to honor your needs, and you need to create a ritual, for example. Do something every day where you're making sure that you are holding space for yourself and whatever you need. So yeah, honor your needs first. That's my big one.
Yeah, it's a great takeaway. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this wonderful conversation, highlighting your journey through grief and caregiving, and now how you're helping others do the same.
Thank you so much for having me. I love this conversation.
Absolutely.